Congress of South African Trade Unions, representing 2.2 million workers, has reacted strongly to the International Monetary Fund's insinuation that unions are to blame for the slow growth of South Africa's economy. The report lays the blame for the poorly performing economy of South Africa on the government's poor record in controlling the wage bill and potential spillovers from high wage demands in other sectors, representing downside risks. Patrick Craven, COSATU national spokesperson, joins me in studio for more. Patrick, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Before we get into the merits of where the blame is, do you agree that South Africa is trailing behind other emerging markets in terms of its economic performance at this time?
We certainly have huge economic problems. We wouldn't dispute that. But where I think we would disagree fundamentally with the International Monetary Fund is that we would say organizations like themselves are more responsible than anybody else for the crisis we're in. Many developing countries have suffered over the years from the measures which the IMF insisted upon countries adopting in return for getting loans.
Right.
And these policies, plus the irresponsible financial policies globally, which caused the huge crisis in 2008, which made all these problems worse, are precisely through the application of the policies which the IMF endorses. And yet they have the impudence to come along and say, oh, no, we're not to blame, it's the workers, it's the unions, it's the poor, who are of course the victims of the crisis, not the cause of it.
Let's look at the labor laws. I mean, one of their key contention points, of course, is that South Africa's labor laws are inflexible and that we don't compare favorably with our economic peers. What is your viewpoint in response to that?
We have shown over and over again that South Africa's labor laws are in line with normal international practice. And if you think that, well, we're maybe biased, the South African director of the International Labour Organization was interviewed and made exactly that point. And he's somebody, Vic van Vuren, who's very familiar with the South African situation, who comes from a business background, right, and yet said, frankly, there's no evidence that South African labour laws are any more rigid or inflexible than any other country.
Would you concede that, Patrick, given the volatility that we've seen in the labour sector, especially around the mining sector in particular, that it does cast a shadow of doubt on that argument, and that South Africa's labour situation right now doesn't really bode well for the country's economic prospects?
But how can someone like the IMF simply say there are too many strikes without even asking themselves, well, why are there so many strikes? And of course there are various reasons, but one common thread is the high levels of inequality in this country. And yet they're proposing a package of measures which would actually make inequality far worse. You quoted what they said about the wage bill.
Right.
So in other words, the very modest increases which workers are trying to get, and unfortunately having sometimes to go on strike to get, are being condemned as excessive. And yet he says nothing about all the business executives who are, relative to the workers, in the most unequal relationship of anywhere in the world. Do they not think that this is significant and that they ought to be looking at the rich instead of trying to make the poor even poorer?
Of course, one of the other recommendations that they've made quite strongly is for the country to embrace the National Development Plan, and I'm quite certain that you have strong reactions to that.
Absolutely. That is the most interesting part of the whole package, because we've been arguing for some time now that there are some very, very worrying parts of the National Development Plan, particularly in relation to economic policy and labour policy. And the fact that it's now been endorsed by the International Monetary Fund proves, I think, that we were absolutely right, because they wouldn't support a policy which was in the interests of the workers or indeed the people of South Africa as a whole. They clearly see the NDP as their strategy, their way in to the economy. And that makes us even more determined that this NDP must be changed radically and fundamentally.
Of course, Craven, for the ordinary South African sitting and listening to how these arguments are going against each other, it might just come across like we're having an ideological war. And at the end of the day, we need to find common ground that is going to translate into a more meaningful livelihood for ordinary South Africans. Do you foresee that a silver lining in that regard? If the IMF continues to release reports of this nature, and obviously these do inform to a large extent not only investor perception, but they do trickle into government policy.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate that investors are so short-sighted that they take seriously an organization like the IMF, which by now they ought to have realized is highly suspect, to say the least. And unfortunately, if they keep issuing reports like this, it'll make it harder to reach agreement. But a crucial role now has to be played by government. And I have to say we're very worried by the initial response of the Treasury, which seems to be quite sympathetic to this report, even though most of its proposals are completely at odds with ANC policy. If you look at the resolution they passed on the second phase of the transition at Mangaung, if you look at many of their government policies, like the Industrial Policy Action Plan, the IMF is moving in a completely opposite direction. And so surely the government is going to have to stand up and say, no, we're not going to be dictated to by this global business organization. Our mandate comes from our conference in Mangaung, from our alliance, and above all, from the people of South Africa.
Before I let you go, it does sound like in between the lines you're saying that this smacks of structural adjustment policies once again. Is
Absolutely.
That your view?
Not between the lines, we've actually said that in our statement, that this is looks like an attempt to go back to the structural adjustment programs, which they forced on many developing countries with disastrous results in every case.